Hey there! In this tutorial we're going to be going over while loops in C, and while loops are really important because they allow you to execute certain lines of code however many times you want, and you can do this based on a condition. For example, if you want your program to restart after it finishes, we often use a while loop. Or if you want to do some data calculations or data processing, then we also use while loops. So while loops are really fundamental when it comes to programming. And I'm creating this tutorial for those people who downloaded my personalized finance app programming guide. Basically, it's a guide that allows you to take your credit card transactions from your credit card company, and then you can categorize them into different budget categories so you know how much you're spending. So it's a fun app, and you can download it in the link in the description. All right, we're going to do this tutorial in Visual Studio Code. So if you haven't set that up, or if you don't know how to set that up, I do have a video going over how to set that up. All right, let's create our file. Let's name it while.c. And then let's do the basic, let's set everything up. I'm gonna add the stdio library. And then I'm gonna make my main function. And then printf. The classic hello world. Alright, let's run that. Okay, it says hello world. Now I wanna do dividers like I always do. So to make a divider I just do this. And if you don't know how to use printf, I have another tutorial about that you can watch. Okay, that looks better. Alright, now how do we do the while loop? So let's create our while loop. This is the basic structure of a while loop. And it goes like this. Alright, this while loop is just gonna keep running and running and running infinitely because there's a 1 here. You can think of 1 meaning true and 0 meaning false for now. This is where the condition lives for the while loop. So you have the condition for your while loop will be here in the parentheses. If it evaluates to 1, then we're gonna enter this line of block of code and we're gonna run this. So if we run this, it's gonna just keep running. It's just gonna keep printing this print statement. So let's run it. Okay, now see it's just continuing to print. Let's stop it. The way you stop it is use Control-C. And this is something you can do in terminal. If you're running a program in terminal, you can always use Control-C to stop it. So I'll show you again. So it's running, and then you're in an infinite loop, and then you do Control-C, and then it just stops. All right, now if you use 0, which means false, the condition is false, so it's not going to enter into this while loop. So let's run it. So you see this print statement isn't shown. It says I'm in the while loop, but so we never enter the while loop. Okay. And if you're programming in other programming languages, this while 0 is often you'll find it. Other languages will look like this. Other coding languages will look like that. But in C, we don't have true and false. We just have 0 and 1. Fun fact: you can actually use 2 as long as it's not 0. You can run this, and the while loop's gonna go. So that's just a fun fact. So that's why I said you can loosely think of 1 as being true and 0 as false. So like I can have whatever number I want, and as long as it's non-zero, the condition's gonna interpret it as true. All right, say we want to do the while loop only 5 times. If we only want to do the loop 5 times, then we have to create a counter, some sort of counter, like a while loop counter. And let's set it equal to 5. Or we set it equal to 0. And then while the while counter is less than 5, then we'll print this. And then you can increment the while counter. And if you don't know what this is, basically it's just this. It's just while counter is equal to while counter plus 1. While counter plus 1. I don't like seeing while here, so let's change the name to loop counter. loop. All right, so it's going to increment. All right, so what's going to happen here is the loop counter, it's 0, and then it runs here, it's going to become 1. And then the while loop will check, is it less than 5? If it's less than 5, then I'm going to run it again. It's only when it's 5 that I'll stop and I'll exit I'm not going to run this anymore. I'm just going to proceed down here to the last instruction here. Okay, so let's try that. All right, so now we see it was printed 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's because it went here when it was 0, it went here when it was 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I can actually show that to you exactly what the loop counter was in each iteration. And an iteration is just one loop through of the while loop. Let's say the counter is equal to %d, and then we're gonna put our counter variable here. And then okay, so you can see here, when it was 0, it went in, it executed this line of code and this line of code, and it just kept going until it was 5. When it hit 5, it didn't enter anymore. Okay, so this is the condition of the while loop. If as long as the loop counter is less than 5, then we're gonna run these 2 commands. All right, another condition I want to go over is a user input condition. So this is called a counter condition. A lot of times when you're doing data processing, you want to run the while loop a certain number of times. So you use a loop counter to make sure you run the while loop. You run this loop, this piece of code, that number of times. But sometimes you want to do a while loop based on user input. Okay, let's create a variable called num iterations, and this is just the number of iterations. So let's call it user num iterations. And we're going to ask the user how many iterations we want to run the while loop. So let's ask the user, how many iterations of the while loop do you want? And then we're going to scan in their response. And if you don't know what this is, you can watch my other video about how to use variables and data in C. Okay, we're storing the number of iterations in this variable, user num iterations. And again, iteration is just the amount of times we're going to go into this while loop. We're going to run this block of code here between the curly brackets. So we ask, how many iterations do you want? And then the user will input 5 maybe. And then we're going to use the number that the user inputted, and then we're gonna run the while loop that many times. So if the user says 5, then we'll run the while loop 5 times. We're gonna run this block of code 5 times. Let's do that so it's easier to read. All right. So how many iterations of the while loop do you want? Let's say 3. Okay, so you got 3 iterations here. 1, 2, 3. And then let's run it again. Let's do 5. I want 5 iterations. There you go. So now you have a while loop that's based on the user condition. A lot of times what we do in programming, or when you're starting off programming, you want to ask the user if you want to finish the program, or if you want to keep running the while loop. And so what we do is we ask the question inside the while loop, and then we can say, so we ask the question, do you want to continue? And then we'll scan in the variable. Let's say 1 for yes, and then let's say 0 for no. So that's the instruction we'll give the user. If they want to continue, just hit 1 for yes, or just input 1 for yes, or just input 0 for no. So let's change the name of the variable. It doesn't make sense anymore. Let's change it to continue. Let's change it to user continue. And now we're not going to use the loop counter anymore because we're not doing it based on the number of loops anymore. So let's remove the counter. And now we're just going to do it based on the user continue. So we have to initialize this variable to 1 so that we can enter the while loop. and then it's going to enter the while loop, and it's going to say I'm in the while loop, and then it's going to say do you want to continue, and then say yes. Yeah, let's remove this, and then you put in 1, and then if it's 1, it's going to continue the while loop. If it's 0, then we exit. Okay. All right, so now I am in the while loop. Do you want to continue being in the while loop? Set 1 for yes, and then it's just going to keep going because we're doing it based on the user input. But if you say 0, then it exits because 0 means false, so while means, so the while condition is false, so we're not going to continue being in this loop. So this is a common way that we use while loops when you're starting off. If you're making a program and you ask the user, do you want to restart? And then you have your code here, like all of your code will be in here. And that's a common use case for the while loop. You can actually do a nested while loop, but I'm not going to go into too much depth because this is not really common. But you can actually do a nested while loop, and then you can do something like this. And nested means you just have a while loop inside a while loop. And you can do something like this. Hello. Loop counter less than 5. Yeah, so let's put back our loop counter. Let's put the question at the end of our code. All right, so this is the main program, like for example, and then we have our do you want to restart, yes or no. Okay, so pretend that your main function is just printing the hello 5 times, and then you have this while loop counter. Yeah, you have this while loop and this loop counter to do that. So this is where your main code lives. And then at the end of your main code, you ask the user if they want to restart the program. And then they can say yes or no. We want to make sure the loop counter is always 0 when we start our program. So we're going to have our main code here. We're going to make sure the loop counter is 0 so that we can do this loop to 5 every time. All right. So that's why I added another one here, even though we already have it here. Yeah. Okay, so let's run this. So there you go. There you have the I'm in the while loop. Hello, 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 hello. Do you want to restart the program? Yes. And there you go. I'm in the loop. Now you restarted the program. This is the program code here. Then it's asking, do you want to restart the program? And then you say yes. And then same thing, keeps going. Then you can just say no, and then you exit the program. All right, so that's an example of a nested while loop. As a while loop inside a while loop. And this doesn't really happen that often unless you have a complicated, or you have some sort of algorithm, a data algorithm where you need to use 2 while loops. But in basic logic, one while loop is usually good enough. And then you do another while loop later on if you need to process some other data. And the last comment I'll make for this video is that while loops are usually where your main code lives. And a lot of people refer to this as the main loop. And sometimes people will say, where's the main loop of your function? Usually it's a while loop. And then this condition is usually the condition to exit the program. So as a beginner, that's the time when you are going to be using while loops the most, as your main loop. Alright, thanks for watching this week's tutorial, and thank you for downloading my personalized finance app programming guide. I hope it's really helpful for you. And if you haven't downloaded it yet, thanks for watching anyways up to this point. I hope it's really helpful for you in your programming journey. Alright, peace.